Hello and welcome to another thrilling installment of Introduction to Politics, Poli-Sci 101 at Mesa College. Today we're going to talk about how civil wars end. As a jumping off point for this discussion, we're going to use figure 1.1 from the Driscoll reading. This figure breaks down potential solutions to civil war problems into four boxes. Where you fall in the four boxes, what theory you think is most important, depends upon your decision on two assumptions. First, along the vertical axis here, does the end of a civil conflict require a decisive military victory? Or could you have peace obtain when there's a stalemate between the factions that are fighting? Then the second question along along the vertical axis here, is whether or not a third party that is interested in intervening in the conflict is capable of doing so. Can a third party monitor or enforce a peace? We've talked about realism before. The assumptions of realism, the dual assumptions of realism, say that wars only end when institutions with the power to control the territory wins. Right? So wars end when locals win them. This is true because stalemates can exist. There's no way to dissuade competitive warlords to stay at peace. They're always going to be maximizing their own play for power. And there's no way that an outside power can manipulate local sentiment or political outcomes because everyone, again, is interested in maximizing their power. You can't force people to support one group or the other. Realism is a good starting place. Because of this, we might expect that civil wars would never settle unless there was a decisive military victory, right? Okay, so if we keep those assumptions in mind, then we can think about each of the other readings that we're discussing as an example of one of the other boxes in this 2x2 chart. All right, let's start with Barb Walters' Critical Barrier to Peace. This is a photo of the El Salvador Peace Accords in which the rebel group settled with a state without having a decisive local victory. So Barb is interested in sussing out why some civil wars are settled this way and others are not. She makes a pair of assumptions that are polar opposite from realism. She argues that realists are wrong. You don't need a decisive victory for wars to end. And in fact, a third party can broker peace. In fact, it's necessary. Why might that be the case? What's the puzzle here? The puzzle is that civil wars are really bad. Lots and lots of actors should have an interest in ending them, but they don't end them, right? What sorts of interests do actors have in ending wars? We've talked before about how wars destroy resources. So even if you end up winning the war, there's less to distribute than you had before. It's also true that most international actors have an incentive to end wars. They're interested in maintaining peace for moral reasons. Maybe we don't want as many people to die. They're interested in putting their thumb on the scale for one party or the other that they think is going to benefit them in some sort of geopolitical fashion. And they're also interested in preventing failed states, which become the locus of terrorist organizations and drug cartels. And despite all of these incentives, less than half of civil conflicts are ever even negotiated, and very few, around 10%, settle into any sort of stable peace. So I guess as I just said, there are some strong economic incentives to end wars. You can split up the resources that the war would have consumed. That should be enticing. People should want to negotiate before the war drags on so long that everything they hope to gain from it is eaten up by the war. Second, there are security reasons. Failed states produce terrorists, and they provide hubs for smuggling and moments where there's gang rule of civilians. And then lastly, we might prefer that there are representative democracies and we don't want people to die, and so we might prefer to end wars in favor of democracies so that fewer people die. Despite this, international wars settle without victory all the time, but civil wars don't. So what's the difference? What's the difference according to Walter? The major difference is that international wars end with negotiation, and neither side loses the ability to protect itself. Unless you have an all-out winner in an international war, both sides get to keep their armies, And if one side or the other reneges on the bargain that they set out, the other side can remobilize its army and go back to war. But that's not true in a civil conflict, right? Once they lay down their weapons, once a rebel group lays down its weapons and begins to integrate into the United States, it becomes almost impossible for either party to enforce cooperation afterward. So, as a result of this, we might expect that third-party guarantors, countries that come in from outside the Civil War, can end those wars by providing a security guarantee. Now, Walter argues that a security guarantor needs to meet a number of tests in order to be a credible guarantor of security. What are those elements? The first is that the party has to be self-interested in peace. You can't have some third party come in to settle a civil war that they don't care about. It usually needs to be someone who sees it as some country that sees the end of the war as being in its own sort of security or economic or moral interest. Second, that party needs to be willing to use force in order to maintain not only the peace, but also the underlying negotiation or underlying bargain that created the peace. And then lastly, they need to be able to credibly signal that they are willing to intervene. Now, of course, we know that this is one explanation for how civil wars might end, and if we want to make sure, using the comparative method, that we have the right explanation, we can't just stop here. We can't just have our own theory and test it. We need to look at alternative explanations. We need to write out our lit review. So here are some other common explanations for when and why civil wars end that have been used to explain variation in whether civil wars come to a negotiated end or not in the past. 1. Civil wars offer a higher reward to the winner than international wars. Right? International wars very rarely end with the complete takeover of a rival country, and even when they do, what you end up with is not some sort of pool of new resources typically, but some successor state that you have to pay taxes to manage. So winning an international war is rarely that good for the country that wins it, whereas the party that wins a civil war gets to maintain control over the entire country. So one of the ways that we might explain why international wars settle and civil wars don't is that civil wars offer more reward to win. There's less incentive to negotiate as a result. Second, maybe civil wars are being fought over spoils that are indivisible. It's one thing to fight over oil revenue between two countries, right? We can just split up the oil revenue. But often there might be nothing to negotiate. If one side wants to take over total control of the government or leave the country completely, there's very little middle ground that you can find, and therefore the negotiation breaks down because the civil wars are like there's no middle ground to negotiate over. The civil wars are fighting over indivisible spoils. Third, maybe civil wars have especially high barriers to negotiation. Maybe we have a divisible spoil. Maybe one group of, maybe the rebel group would like to have control over one ethnicity, and the state would like to have control over the other ethnicity. But the populations are intermingled, and they speak different languages, and so it's difficult to come together to a negotiating table. It's actually hard to get together a negotiator or put together a negotiation. The technical challenges of that negotiation are just too high. And lastly, maybe civil wars are really emotional. Maybe we go to international war for rational reasons, broadly rational reasons, as we've discussed in our international war unit, but at the same time, we fight civil wars over emotional issues. All right, so we have 5 theories, so we should expect that we have 5 hypotheses, right? We should expect that the presence of a willing third-party guarantor interested in using violence to underwrite a peace settlement has a higher chance of peace. According to our second theory, that which predicts that civil wars are less likely to settle because the reward is higher, we might see a higher chance of settlement where the cost of fighting the war is higher, right? If the reward is higher, then we know that the war should end if the cost of the war goes up. If the problem with civil wars is that there are indivisible issues that cannot be negotiated, then what we should expect to see is that civil wars where there is a divisible outcome have a higher chance of settlement than those where it's obviously not divisible. If this is about the negotiation costs, if negotiation costs are simply too high to settle some civil wars, well then higher skilled negotiators should allow us to settle civil wars more often. And if we're fighting over emotional things, well, very straightforwardly, we should be able to identify when we're fighting over something emotional, and those emotional wars should drag on forever, and wars over more rational things should not. Those should settle more frequently. So, now we should want to know how Walter plans to measure these concepts, right? For example, how do we measure the skill of a negotiator at a negotiation conference for peace? Well, let's take a look at how all of these concepts are measured. First, let's take a look at the DV. Walter has two DVs that she's interested in. The first is whether there is a negotiation of any kind. Here's how she measures that, right? Both sides need enough bargaining power to elicit concessions from the other, right? The United States negotiated a peace with Japan at the end of World War II, but it wasn't really a negotiation at that point. So Walter argues that we need to measure and see if there are important concessions coming from both sides. Second, the factions need to actually meet face to face and talk about the relevant issues related to resolving the war. So what Walter's attempting to do here is weed out insincere meetings that happen because one group is really, really winning and they're just going to lord it over the other group and they're going to negotiate a peace conference for the press cameras, or places in which they both want to appease maybe international observers, but neither of them have any interest in actually concluding the conflict, right? The second DV that Walter cares about is whether the war actually ends, right? So a war ending decisively through negotiation can't be a decisive victory. We want to exclude any sorts of wars that end, again, in one of these negotiations that might look a lot like the Japanese-American negotiation after World War II. We also want to see, as a way to guarantee this, that the peace accords were jointly drafted, the opposition gets to survive, usually as a political party that has a real opportunity to win an election, and that the peace lasts for at least 5 years. So these are the ways in which we're going to measure our dependent variable, whether there were negotiations, whether the war actually ended. Independent variables, whether there's a third-party guarantor. Here we've got sort of a 4-step measurement. In the first step, there is no promise. No third party comes to the table whatsoever. In the second step, there's a weak promise. Some third-party country says, I declare that I will help. Who knows if they mean it? A moderate promise involves the deployment of troops, but no more than 500. Certainly not enough to actually matter unless they are supplemented if the war breaks out again. And then lastly, a strong promise in which the deployment by the third-party security guarantor is so overwhelming that it's very obvious from the get-go that they are willing to underwrite the peace with violence. How might we measure whether the war has a higher cost of winning, which therefore overbalances the higher benefits of winning? 4 indicators, right? The duration of the war. As the war drags on longer, it must be costing more. The presence of a military stalemate. The battle lines aren't moving anywhere. The magnitude of the war, how many battle deaths there are, and the intensity of the war, measured in battle deaths per month. So as we see the number of people dying increase, the amount of movement along the front lines decrease, and the duration of the war drag on, we can intuit from these things, Walter argues, that the cost of the war is going up. So the wars that are longer and have more fatalities and where the battle lines move less are more likely to settle if the theory that civil wars drag on because they are worth more money to the fighters is true. For high-skilled negotiator, we just ask how often the mediator was present. Obviously, mediators that never show up are probably pretty low-skilled. There's really no way in her measurement strategy to determine between a dedicated but terrible negotiator and a great negotiator. For identity conflict, very straightforward. We ask whether the war was between ethnic or religious groups, and if so, were they fighting over some form of ethnic or religious difference? We can take a look just at the breakdown of where there were decisive victories versus settlements to see that there is some plausibility to Walter's theory, right? What should we expect if Walter is right? We should see settlements more often where there are guarantees. How does this look? Right? There are a couple of settlements where we have no guarantees, but in every circumstance where there was any form of guarantee, the war ultimately settles successfully, right? We also might look to what rebel leaders say about peacekeeping operations or guarantees, right? If rebel leaders are looking for a third party guarantor to underwrite the peace, what will they say when they're asked? Here, we see Robert Mugabe, who you might know as the late president of Zimbabwe and despot, but who cut his teeth as a politician, as a hero of Zimbabwe's independence movement against Rhodesia, say that the support of the South African forces were absolutely essential. Right? Walter presents a number of quotes like this from Sudan, South Africa, and elsewhere, showing that revolutionary groups are much more willing to lay down their arms when a credible third party emerges to guarantee that the peace will be respected. Okay, which variables are consistently related to settlement talks? You can see here that the security guarantee is highly significant. It has 2 stars, nothing else has more than 1 star. Right, so we can expect that there's support. We know that there's support for Barb Walter's theory. Oh, sorry, I switched the slide on you. So here our dependent variable is whether there's a negotiation at all, right? There's a strong relationship between a security guarantee and a negotiation, and there is a relatively weak relationship between costs and negotiation. No relationship, notice, between divisibility, the strength of the mediator, or the identity characteristics of the war. These things appear facially to be unrelated to whether or not a war will settle. Here, we have the actual settlement characteristic, right? Now, the evidence is even clearer, right? The security guarantee remains very strongly related to whether we will see a peaceful settlement, and the cost stars drop away. So in general, there's very, very little relationship between settlement and the operationalization of the variables that represent the other theories of why civil wars may or may not settle. So for this reason, Walter is able to argue that outside forces can provide security guarantees and end civil wars. So if this is true, if Barb Walter is right, and states care for a variety of moral and self-serving reasons about ending conflict, right? Remember, maybe we don't like watching civilians die. Maybe we prefer one side to win versus the other for geopolitical reasons. Maybe we want to end the Civil War so there's no terrorist or drug cartels that can work in those areas. Maybe we want the Civil War to end so we can trade more freely with the country. Why don't third parties step in more often? Right? So to consider this, we have to look at models of when and why states intervene, and how often or how intervention works once it's underway. And to do that, we'll turn first to Fearon and Leighton's neoliberal trusteeship. This should look familiar from the top left corner of our chart. So again, to Driscoll here. According to Fearon and Leighton, wars only end when someone wins. But that someone can be an outside power that comes in and just clobbers everyone that's local, right? So they create a decisive victory that generates lasting order. You don't need to have some sort of guarantor if the United States comes in and takes out Saddam or goes in and takes out both the provisional government and the Taliban in Afghanistan. In this sort of a circumstance, we have something called postmodern imperialism, according to Driscoll in his chart here, or neoliberal trusteeship, according to the title of Fearon and Leighton's article, right? So isn't this just colonialism? The most obvious moral question that we have here, there's a little bit of fencing of words going on. Driscoll calls it imperialism. Fearon and Leighton call it trusteeship. What's actually going on here? Well, Fearon and Leighton argue that there's actually a difference between old-style colonialism and new trusteeship. First, the rule is largely multilateral. They argue that you can't have a conglomerate of countries sucking the resources out of some place like Iraq, if it's being led multilaterally. That's very different, they argue, than France or Britain taking over large swaths of Africa or South Asia and just using them as an extraction engine for wealth generation in Europe. Second, imperial ventures in the 19th century were indefinite. The point of the British being in India was to bring back spices that, puzzlingly, no one in Britain was ever going to use based on their cuisine. But postmodern imperialists want to rebuild self-supporting polities as quickly as possible. They want to get out. This is costly for them. So the model of postmodern imperialism or neoliberal trusteeship is probably the reconstruction programs the United States led in the wake of post-World War II. The U.S. and their allies took over governance in these places for a time, but the mainstream interpretation of these programs is that the U.S. really didn't want to use Germany or Japan as a colony. They wanted to rebuild a liberal country that would participate in American global orders for their benefit and for ours. And so Fear and Leighton think that this is a moral distinction between old-style colonialism and modern trusteeship. Okay, so political problem then. If ending civil wars is good, for the same reason that Walter discusses, why don't powerful states flood in to end them? Right? This is Fearon and Leighton's preferred outcome. We should have third-party states crush civil wars, guarantee the peace, and then move on. So why doesn't this happen? First problem is underfunding. The P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, that is the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France, knowingly underfund their mandates. They want to look like they're doing something, but if there's a failure, right, they can blame the UN for its supposed inefficiencies. This is just a way for us to mitigate our losses, look like we're doing something without really doing something. So why doesn't the UN or the rest of the member states call out this underfunding? Well, they accept the underfunding in the hopes that they can fix it later. The crisis in war-torn countries is so bad that we can't turn down any help, and we're hoping for this foot-in-the-door strategy, right? Once we have some funding for keeping the people of Darfur safe, maybe the UN, will actually fund it properly. Another potential reason that it doesn't work, there's a lack of coordination between the parties that matter. What does this mean? Think for a second. If Fearon and Leighton would like for a multilateral coalition to come in and handle a civil conflict, what would be required for coordination? Sharing of intelligence, cross-command of troops, a common strategic vision for the region or the country at issue, and you can start to see why this might be a problem. Do you expect Trump and Putin and Xi to share their intelligence or their troops with one another? Would Russian troops be commanded by American troops? Do you think they're going to share intelligence? Do you think that they have any sort of similar geostrategic preferences for what happens in Syria or the broader Middle East? This is a problem, Fearon and Leighton argue, that we would need to solve in order to usher in a new and beneficial era of neoliberal trusteeship. A third reason, mission creep. What does mission creep mean? Mission creep becomes a problem because peace isn't settled, according to Fearon and Leighton, and keep this in mind. Peace isn't settled, according to Fearon and Leighton, unless you are capable of rebuilding a state that can police its own internal affairs. And if you decimate a state government to end a civil war, well, then you have a state that has collapsed. You can't leave. A neo-trusteeship state can't leave. The foreign intervention can't end until the state is rebuilt, which requires troops to engage in things like policing and school building and road repairs. For Walter, the third-party commitment by itself leads to peace, and that's enough to solve this problem. But she ignores issues that may arise from attempts by third-party states to implement their social goals. State building requires a long-term commitment, and states might not be willing to pay that cost. Lastly, we have a free rider problem, right? Maybe what we ought to do is encourage the states with the most immediate interests in peace to pay, right? If the United States has the largest strategic interest in what's happening in Guatemala, then maybe the United States should pay the lion's share of state building in Guatemala. Well, what would any state worth its salt say? We don't care, right? We don't care what happens there. It's not our interest isn't the leading strategic interest. It's Mexico's, or it's Brazil's, or it's Colombia's. Someone else should be footing the bill. And then the United States gets for free what it could have paid for. The second potential way to mitigate a free rider problem is to try and cost share, which is something that we attempt to do. But there are problems, right? States will lie about how much they care. And if these states had the money, would we be saving them in the first place, right? Could we be charging them the money to save their own country? Okay, so 3 avenues by which we might solve these coordination and free rider problems. First, we might encourage a lead state system that intervenes in weak state conditions. right? Second, we might engage in studies that learn and replicate the success of on-the-ground organizational innovations. And then lastly, we might promote common peacekeeping operations standards through international training programs and command structures. Let's go through each of these in turn. Well, actually, I mean, we can go through maybe some of the problems right away, right? Nominate lead states to command a common force. Gee, I wonder why anyone would resist this. I wonder why Russian troops might not want to be commanded by Americans or vice versa. Learning and applying the lessons of successes, well, that assumes that everyone agrees on what the lesson is or what success is and is willing to pay for the studies that deliver these results in the first place. I can tell you, as someone who runs these studies, it's not always easy to find the money. International troop standards, again, who gets to decide what the standards are? We might also think about accountability or oversight mechanisms as potential solutions, but again, we have to balance two important competing interests. If there's some sort of accountability standard that forces the lead state to make their troops behave, to stay until they're done, we need to balance the need for oversight with the concerns of peacekeeping states about keeping their own soldiers safe. Right? The United States has on more than one occasion pulled peacekeeping troops out of vital areas because the peacekeeping theater was threatening to hold American troops accountable to local standards of justice. Now, there's a cynical way to view this, right, which is that the United States is just attempting to allow its soldiers to abuse whomever they want. But it's probably a little scary to think about American troops being overseas and being held accountable to justice systems that we might think are corrupt or in a pre or post-corrupt phase right as the state is being rebuilt. There are some real problems with expecting powerful states to send their troops into places where they lose control over how those troops are punished or overseen, right? So we might also build into these peacekeeping agreements exit strategies that allow states to slowly transition how much they pay for peacekeeping solutions, right? To recover the tax revenue that the United States has spent peacekeeping various places, we might slowly transition payment and responsibility for payment over to the state that has been, in air quotes, rescued, right? How well have these engineering strategies worked out so far for the West? Not particularly well. You know, we've attempted to force Iraq and Afghanistan to collect better taxes or to sell oil at certain prices that allow us to repay the United States for the money that we've spent in peacekeeping. But that hasn't worked out very well because these states, the reason that they needed a neoliberal trustee in the first place is because they don't have the capacity to penetrate society and gather these taxes in the first place. So why might that be, right? If Walter sees that peacekeeping operations can be successful, and Fearon and Leighton provide some measure of solutions for how states can cut costs by engaging in best practices and good oversight. Why might it be that states are unwilling to do this or that states fail to do it when they are willing to do it? And to answer that question, we'll turn to our last reading for the week, Jesse Driscoll's Warlords and Coalition Politics. Here we have an interesting puzzle. Why did order consolidate so quickly in post-Soviet states? In the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have all of these countries that are newly created. There are lots of security arrangements that are precariously balancing ethnic or religious groups. And yet the wars that settled out who would be in control of these states moved relatively quickly. How did that happen? Perhaps Russia intervened. Maybe this is a Barb Walter story. Russia got in there right away and Russia did something right. Maybe Western powers capitalized on ebbing Russian power and got in there themselves, right? Maybe this is a neoliberal trusteeship story in which a Fearon and Leighton style mechanism unfolded. Maybe development NGOs stabilized an uncertain situation. Maybe we sent in all of our pro-democracy, pro-capitalist think tanks, and they got something about policy right, something that helped these states consolidate in the aftermath. We might actually also ask what the actual distribution of control is in Central Asian states. Driscoll argues that from the outside, it looks like the presidents of these countries are firmly in control, but when you look deeper, we see a different story. Okay, so there is some reason, as both Walter and Fearon and Leighton have pointed out, to believe that UN peacekeepers are capable of maintaining some level of peace. Here we have a photo of UN peacekeepers in Bosnia. The US doesn't take over here, the UN doesn't take over here, they just police. And by and large, this was a relatively successful intervention. The UN was capable of keeping the peace. But Driscoll argues that Fearon and Leighton and Walter both make assumptions that are unsustainable in many cases, including the cases he studies in Georgia and Tajikistan. What is that assumption? Right? For our purposes, this is the most important distinction in Driscoll's argument, right? What does monitoring really entail according to Driscoll? What specifically is the capacity difference implied by this assumption? If you think it's possible for third parties to monitor or enforce peace agreements, what do you think that they're doing? This. Monitoring land reform, privatization of businesses where very few of the executives speak your language, complex credit swaps that are oftentimes being cemented by family relationships, money laundering, price fixing schemes. Profit from these dealings requires a lot of informal understanding, and the warlords who command the force that are capable of profiting from these sorts of relations are really able to hide what they're doing from third-party guarantors. It's very, very difficult for the United States to go into a place like Iraq and police it. You simply can't tell what's happening on in the localities well enough to undermine the power of the warlord. So, what is a plausible solution to this according to Driscoll? Who does understand what he calls the micro contours of the socioeconomic relationships in these areas? It's the locals themselves, right? Driscoll argues that we can end civil wars without local knowledge and without decisive victory if we add incentives that change warlord strategies. So how does that work? We nominate a president that we like, and we provide them with stacks of cash. We watch the warlords gather. The president isn't strong enough to protect the state and its money by himself, so if he goes away, the warlords get all the money, but then the next round of payments don't come. The United States or the West or NATO isn't interested in funding these warlords. They wanted to fund the president, right? That's too bad for all of the warlords who cashed in their payday just a minute too early. So how might our actors solve these problems? Driscoll argues that a wise president will use the money to do two things, two related things. First, he'll offer money to some of the warlords. Second, he'll maximize his own share, the share that he gets to redistribute. Notice that this guy got cut out. That's not because I was too lazy to cut and paste another money bag. That's because the president doesn't think he needs this warlord to run the country. The other warlords will bury him, and they'll keep their own money. And in order to make sure that they get a bigger cut of the next round of payments, they have an incentive to bury this guy. Or will they join? The president's play in the game is to pick a coalition of warlords that can cut out the rest. He wants to select a coalition of warlords that's strong enough to cut those that he doesn't select out. But each warlord has some territory or some group of people loyal to them whom they can abuse for their own resources. So the warlord has to choose. Do they accept the president's offer, or do they retreat to their stronghold and keep taxing their own peasants independently? How do we make this decision, right? How to choose? What does the warlord need to know? Well, first, the warlord needs to know how much is on offer if he goes back home. But he also needs to know another fact. What are the chances that the government of the president survives? Say there's the possibility that the state survives is P, because P stands for probability, and say that there is a reciprocal probability that the state fails. We call this probability Q, presumably because the lowercase q is the mirror image of P. So as a side note, P plus Q will always equal 1. The state will either fail or it will not. One of those things is going to happen. So The warlord only gets to keep the state's money if the state survives. So the value of the state's offer isn't 2 bags of money. The value of the state's offer is 2 bags of money times the probability that the warlord gets to keep the two bags of money. You might have guessed already that if the warlord elects to take his ball and go home and the state survives, it will attempt to come after him and take the ball. So the value of his return to his own people is 1 bag of money times the probability that the state survives. Right? There's a risk in either side that you lose your money. Here the state fails, you lose your money. Here the state survives, you lose your money. Okay. So the warlord is left to decide which of these possibilities maximizes his own income. But in a country with a bunch of warlords, how does the warlord guess at how likely the state is to survive? Well, the warlord would need to know whether the state has a large enough coalition of the remaining warlords to win this round of the game. Remember, this guy didn't get an offer, so he has no choice but to go home and hope that the state doesn't get his income, doesn't come and get the income from his peasants, that these warlords don't consolidate control by cutting him out. This leaves our warlord to wonder, if I leave too, will the state collapse? Can the state survive if the coalition is just these two? If the answer is yes, then we surely take the state's offer. P is so huge and Q is so small. The probability that the state survives is so huge and the probability that the state fails is so small that the size of the offer hardly matters. Now, obviously, this game gets really complicated for the warlords who don't know exactly how powerful each rival is or exactly how much loot each set of peasants in the state is offering, but let's pretend the state gets it right and the coalition of our 3 warlords eliminates the 4th. We then move on to a second round of the game in which there are 3 warlords left, and the next shipment of international aid comes in. What do you suppose happens next? The president chooses a new coalition and attempts to eliminate the 3rd warlord, and over and over and over again until all the warlords are either gone or they've become explicitly part of the government. So notice the difference in Driscoll's theory of how wars end. The West is very powerful, but it's ultimately unable to control social outcomes. The imperialist can influence the outcome not by coming in with overwhelming force and engaging in social engineering, but by funding a coalition made by a president who incentivizes the warlords to use their local knowledge to eliminate rivals, ultimately leading to a unified government. Does this work? Driscoll provides strong evidence in his book about Georgia and Tajikistan. The picture on the top left, I didn't choose these people for my health or for random searches for presidents and rebels. The picture on the top is Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan. The bottom photo is Rashid Dostum, the president or a general in the Afghan army, a powerful warlord, and Ghani's vice president. Now, Ghani's no fool. Before becoming president, he wrote a book about how the very types of parallel structures Driscoll thinks delivered relative peace in his cases eats the state's capacity from the inside, and yet Ghani has had to play the warlord game in Afghanistan. Now, the U.S. isn't buying presidents in the same way that Russia did in Georgia or Tajikistan, so maybe the comparison is unfair, but it's worth noting that 15 years of American aid payments haven't allowed the Afghan president to completely uproot the warlords yet. Okay. Hopefully, then you will understand this graph for purposes of the exam. I hope that you've had a wonderful spring break, and I look forward to talking to you again next week.